Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Bill Burns, the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I am truly delighted to welcome back to Carnegie, at least virtually, Ghassan Salamé, a longtime friend and one of the finest scholars of the Middle East and the very best diplomats that I've ever known. Our subject today is Libya, the incredibly complicated conflict which has raged there for nearly a decade. A combustible story of stubborn local rivals and the external players who have fed and fueled their worst instincts. I can think of no one better able to reflect on the lessons of this terrible conflict and the uncertain road ahead than Ghassan Salamé. From 2017 until earlier this year, Ghassan served as the UN Secretary General's special representative in Libya. With tireless energy, remarkable determination, political courage, and diplomatic creativity, he sought to end the fighting and build an inclusive national conference into stable, durable governance in Libya, with the regional and international support it so desperately requires. We can learn a lot from Ghassan's heroic efforts about the pathologies of the Libyan parties themselves, the narrow agendas of outside players, and the limits of even the most skillful of mediation efforts. I can also think of no one better place to moderate this discussion than Robin Wright, another longtime friend. Now a columnist at The New Yorker, Robin is not only a best-selling author and prize-winning journalist, but is fine an observer of the Middle East, as I know. So thank you all again. I know you'll enjoy the conversation. And Robin, let me turn things over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you to Carnegie for organizing this very timely event. I'm particularly honored to be moderating this event with Ghassan, whom I first met almost 40 years ago. So I have known him for more than half my life. We bump into each other all over the world, from many places in the Middle East to Europe, and most recently on a street corner in New York when we were both at the UN General Assembly. And we had a fascinating breakfast talking about our subject today, which is Libya. So Ghassan, let me begin. Libya is now almost a decade into its conflict. It is today a failed state. There are two governments vying for control. In the east, the government of national accord led by Prime Minister Sarraj, recognized by the United Nations, and a host of militias, but it has failed to exert nationwide control and is plagued by infighting. And then in the east, you have a rival government in the House of Representatives that is allied with General Haftar. So I want to begin this first section of questioning on Libya itself. Let's save the foreign issues and foreign meddling for the next round of questioning. But in this first round, what are the roots of Libya's conflict for Libyans? Is it over ideology, Islamist politics versus secular politics? Is it over oil? Is it over regional rivalries, Tripoli versus Benghazi, a rivalry that dates back millennia? And how has it evolved over the decade? How have the issues, the flashpoints for Libyans evolved?
Thank you very much, Robin. I believe that the first thing you are faced with when you are in charge of a file like Libya is to have a proper diagnosis. Because if your diagnosis is wrong, then everything you do is beside the point. And you hear people and they tell you, Libya, I'm going to explain Libya to you. It's this or that. So you have many explanations. They are not mutually exclusive, but I'll tell you where I put my hierarchy myself. Some people would tell you it's a tribal issue. And there is a foreign minister from a leading country in the region who keeps calling me every now and then and tell me, bring me the 100 heads of the tribes to my country, and I will sort of gather them, pay some of them, deter some of them, and they will come together and they will finish the problem. This is not possible. There is tribalism in Libya, but there are no tribes as political agencies. Modernity and Gaddafi have done a lot in order to disintegrate the tribes And if you want one tribe, you will find 10 people who will pretend to be the head of that tribe. So you cannot really ignore the tribes, but you cannot rely on them as political players, as political agencies. So some people come and say, no, it is not that. The question, like everywhere else, since 1967 at least, is secular versus Islamist. This is true. There are Islamist groups in Libya. But when there were elections in 2012 and 2014, the Islamist line, in particular the Muslim Brothers, did not make more than 10 or 15% of the voting. The society is very conservative. It is Muslim in its outlook and in its Weltanschauung, but I don't think that political Islam is so strong in the country. And therefore, you cannot say that the conflict is mainly between Islamist and anti-Islamist, as some countries would like it to be. Then comes a third theory. Forget about all this. The real story is between authoritarianism and democracy. It's also true, but only partly true. It is true that General Haftar has an authoritarian plan for Libya. But it is also true that on the other side, you do not have a true civil state or a true civil society. You have a number of groups, armed groups, fighting against each other, and certainly rejecting any kind of new dictatorship in the country. But this does not mean that the main sort of name of the game is truly authoritarianism versus democracy. Then what? Some people would tell you it's basically a fight among foreign forces. So forget about the Libyans and look at them. We will look at them later in the program.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to discuss this right now, but this would make Libyans entirely spectators to their own drama. And this is not true. This is not true. There is a fifth line I have not looked at carefully when I went there, but I learned there. And I had to sort of amend my diagnosis of the situation in Libya. Libya is also a kleptocracy. Libya is also a place where a lot of money is made, a lot of currency is printed, not in the same place, sometimes in London, sometimes in Moscow, sometimes elsewhere, and this money disappears. It disappears because a lot of people are in positions in order to take money. And unless the UN in the future introduces this dimension in peacemaking, we would miss a very central issue. This is true for Libya, this is true for Iraq, and this is absolutely true for my country that has devolved into a kleptocracy as well.
Yeah.
So you have the 5 things, you have to take them into consideration, and you certainly should not forget the 5th thing, which is not usually in the program or the diagnosis of any UN mediator I know.
Okay, so give us a scorecard for October 2020. Who's ahead politically, militarily, and why?
Well, for a while, there was some kind of a balance in the country. It was basically General Haftar trying to sort of control the East, which he succeeded in doing when he won the Battle of Derna in spring of 2018. And then he started moving to the south in January 2019. And this was not taken too seriously by people in the West. People believed that it is better that somebody goes there and puts some law and order. And then in April 2019, he decided to attack Tripoli itself. And then the situation became different. And the people in Tripoli, in Zawiya, in Misrata, and elsewhere refused this attack. For like 1 year, the pressure was very heavy between April 19 and April 20 on the city, on the main city, Tripoli, from Haftar forces. But in the spring of 2020, with a lot of help from Turkey in particular, and the arrival of a number of, in fact, thousands of Syrian fighters brought in by the Turks, we have seen a change in the balance of power on the ground. And Mr. Haftar and his troops had to withdraw to a new line that was established slowly and gradually and informally which is called now the Sirte-Joffre line that divides the country into two, basically. To the west, you have the GNA, UN-recognized government with all these armed groups supporting it and sometimes fighting among each other like they did last week in Tajura. It's like West Beirut in 1988, if you remember. And on the other side, you have basically the troops of General Haftar, but with also some people there not very happy with his leadership of the eastern part of the country. But to a large extent, the situation is now a situation of a balance of terror, if you want, with this Sirte-Joffre line that cuts the country into two. In the west, you have Mr. Sarraj, the GNA, and like 20 or 25 armed groups from various cities in the west. And to the east, you have General Haftar and the parliament led by Mr. Aqil Saleh in Tobruk.
Okay, so this is a logical.
That's why I think this is the proper moment. This is one of the best moments to start and have a political settlement. Because I think that we are somehow in a situation of a military impasse.
That's a great sequence. And so let's turn for a moment to the international role, because Libya, as you mentioned, is also a proxy war. It has sucked in regional rivals from across the Middle East, from North Africa to the Gulf, as well as European countries, sometimes again rivals from France to Russia, in a way that Lebanon's war once did. So what was the turning point for foreign intervention in Libya? And how much of the conflict today is due to foreign meddling?
Look, Robin, I don't know of a single civil war in the world today that is contained within the limits of the country. So Libya is no exception. You mentioned Lebanon. I could mention Syria. I could mention Yemen. I could mention Iraq. I could mention Congo. I could mention many countries. We live in an era where a civil war does not mean a domestic war. In every war I know of now, there is some kind of interference. However, when it comes to Libya, the interference started with day one, with the intervention by NATO, and it never stopped since. It never stopped since. And in the past few months, it reached a point where you can say, basically, that the country is entirely being raped, collectively raped, by like 10 various countries interfering in different ways. And when I say interference, it means a lot of things. It means that you give money. Some countries are giving money to the various, or you give weapons, or you give ammunition, or you send mercenaries from your own country, or you send mercenaries from some other country, or you interfere directly with your airplanes, or you bring your military engineers to build Hawks, anti-aircraft machinery, or you send your own private military firms to operate in that country. All this is done usually with a high level of deniability and a high level of remote control war making. So it is not proxy in the old style, like I take one group and I support it. What is being done in Libya is not a proxy war. It's much more than that. It's war by remote control, where you interfere directly through your own private military firms or through mercenaries from here and there. You bring from here, Syria, Sudan, Darfur, you name it, and you let them fight and die in Libya. You send your own planes sometimes. You send your military engineers sometimes. So you don't have only support to local groups, as was the case, say, in Lebanon, you mentioned. Now you have direct interference, where sometimes one plane, you don't know where it comes from, comes and hits a target and disappears. And you have the largest battle of drones. And drones have the beauty of being anonymous. They disappear, they hit and run. So the country now is really, really devastated by this. Fortunately, some kind of a ceasefire has been put in place, which did not mean that some of these foreign powers have stopped building up their anti-aircraft or their sending of mercenaries. It's still going on right now on both sides. But to a certain extent, some kind of a ceasefire, informal ceasefire, has been established since the month of July. And I hope it stays with us. It can disappear tomorrow. It's a very fragile one. It's not written anywhere. The US has played some role in reaching it. The UN has played a big role in reaching it, but it can falls any day. It can disappear anyway, and that's why we need to keep it, and we need to use this period of time where fighting is not taking place in order to push for a political settlement. But what I want to add to that is the fact that if you look carefully, Robin, not so many people are being killed in Libya. And this is the good thing about, if you look at the ratio between the weapons, the millions of pieces of weapons left by Gaddafi, probably like 4 pieces for each Libyan, like 20 million pieces of weapon for 5 or 6 million Libyans, plus all the weapons that came since 2011. The country is full of weaponry and ammunition and foreign interference, but the number of those killed in fighting is quite limited. In 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks between Azerbaijan and Armenia, they have already gone into the 400 or 500 people killed. In the whole attack of Haftar against West Libya for 1 year, around 300 people were killed. But we are not counting the mercenaries. And the mercenaries remain the sort of black hole of, but Libyan civilian casualties around 300. I'm happy with that because it means that the ratio between the intensity of the fighting and the number of casualties is limited. And this is due to the fact that a lot of the fighting is being done by mercenaries or by direct interference of foreign forces.
So we'll get to mercenaries and drones in a minute, but let's do a breakdown of who's involved, what foreign powers are involved in Libya, and why. In the West, you have support from Turkey, from Qatar, from Italy. In the East, Russia, the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and France have all supported Haftar. So let's look at each one. So what do the Russians want out of this? And is it part of a broader attempt to get tentacles reaching into the Mediterranean, given that in Syria, they've established both a naval base and an air base as a result of the war? Is this something that's part of a broader strategy to penetrate the Mediterranean?
Robin, nothing hurts me as much as the fact that when I compare Libya to other countries I had to deal with, Iraq, for example, or Lebanon, or other countries, even Myanmar, I feel that foreign countries are much more interested in Libya than in the Libyans. And therefore, they are looking at Libya as a prize. They are not looking at Libya as a place where you need to do. I think the UN is interested in the Libyans. I was certainly interested in them. My colleagues who are still there working very hard and very well to try and implement the Berlin conclusions are interested and concerned about the Libyans. But when you look at the countries, they are much more interested in Libya and very, very, very little or marginally interested in the Libyans themselves. Because the country is big, because the country is very well situated. If you look in particular at one military base built in 1999 under Gaddafi, Qardabiya, it's to the west of Sirte, is one of the largest military bases in the world, certainly in the Mediterranean. If you look at it, it's exactly in the center of the Mediterranean Sea. And if you tell me whoever controls that military base will be in control of the center of the Mediterranean, I will tell you yes. That is why, yes, the Turks are looking at it and the Russians are there and would like to keep it. And the coastline goes, if you want, from Italy towards towards Turkey. It faces all the Mediterranean, Crete, Greece, etc., etc. So it's a very long coastline. Plus, it's oil. And it's oil, a lot of it, and a lot of it is being discovered offshore right now, gas in particular. And it's easy and it's high quality. It's one of the best quality on earth. And it's so close to the market. So this is not only oil, it's oil plus. It's oil that is cheap to produce. It's oil that is first quality. It's very close to the market. So it has all this into it. And that is why, yes. Plus, you have a number of contracts in billions of dollars signed by Gaddafi with Russia, with Turkey, and with other countries to build railroads, to build airports, to buy things, etc. And these countries would like these contracts to be inherited by the new authority and to be able for them to also make money in that country and not only to extract oil.
So you mentioned the Turks. What do the Turks want besides the kind of business relationship? Is there something strategic for the Turks as well? Or is this somewhat going back to the argument of political Islam versus kind of secular politics?
All of this. I remember in 2011, I was in Istanbul. We had a meeting of the crisis group there, and the foreign minister there, Ahmed Davutoglu, was there. And he turned to me and he said, look, Ghassan, we were kicked out by the Italians out of Libya in 1911. 1 century, 2011, we are back there. So there is this idea of a neo-Ottoman re-expansion that you see elsewhere in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. But you definitely see it in Libya, which was an Ottoman province until 1911. But you have contracts signed with large companies for power production, for airport building, etc. The Turks want to have. And there is oil. And there is also this new definition of economic zone across the Mediterranean. That is why the two agreements signed by the GNA with Turkey in December 2019, when Mr. Sarraj and the GNA were in a very weak position militarily, are so crucial for the Turks. Because on the one hand, there is one of these two agreements that gives them a lot of entry into the Mediterranean, something the Greeks, the Italians, and the Egyptians will never accept, a demarcation in the Mediterranean that makes sort of Turkey and Libya together share a large chunk of the Mediterranean Sea, including some part of Crete, which is something Greece, Italy, etc. would never accept. But it gives them a very important access to oil and to the Mediterranean Sea, etc. And there is also a security agreement that gives them access to military bases in Libya. That is why the Turks have invested a lot in the success of the GNA with whom they signed these two very, very important agreements in December 2019.
So let's turn to the Gulf. It's very striking, the role of the Emiratis in this conflict. The UAE only in recent years has become more engaged in kind of promoting its agenda, whether in Yemen or in Libya. It seems more activist than it has been in the past. So what do the Emiratis want out of this? Is this simply to contain the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist tendencies, or is there something bigger for the UAE in this too?
I think there is this. It's crucial. The UAE believes it's in an ideological regional fight against political Islam almost everywhere, Libya included. But it also has another dimension. You know that the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have been instrumental in the establishment of the present regime in Egypt. And they believe that they are also helping Egypt defend itself by interfering in Libya. And therefore, this is also a dimension that should be kept in mind, that they believe that the present regime in Egypt and the national interest of Egypt in general, security interest of Egypt, should not be hurt by what is happening in Libya. And if the Turks are in control of Libya, neither one of the two countries, Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, would be very happy. That is why they have been interfering. But I tend to believe that K Street and Washington in general is too interested in what Gulfis do in Libya. I think they underestimate the neighboring countries because they are poorer also, and because the Gulf countries are more active on K Street than, say, some other countries. Do not overestimate the role of distant countries in that conflict.
Well, we'll get to the West and the United States in a minute, but I want to look at some of the aspects of the military engagement and what the foreign powers that are providing arms and mercenaries. So specifically, let's look at the arms embargo, which was imposed in 2011 and no one seems to have honored. Why have there been no penalties? Why has there been no ability to contain this incredible flow of arms into Libya?
I have to be very honest with you, Robin. When on the 4th of April 2019, Haftar started his attack against the West, against Tripoli, I was representing a Security Council that recognized the GNA, while most members of the Security Council were more or less supporting Mr. Haftar. So put yourself in my shoes that day. You represent an organization that recognizes one government, while you know that most of the 15 members of the Security Council, including some permanent members, do support the other side. And when I went with the Secretary General to meet with Mr. Haftar on April the 5th, he did not hesitate to tell us, hey, why are you critical of my attack? Mr. Bolton called me 2-3 days ago and told me if you need to do it quick. So in English. So if you are in that situation, you are in a completely surreal situation as a UN man. On the one hand, a Security Council resolution asks you to recognize one government, and in practice, the majority of the members of the Security Council are supporting the other player. Therefore, we are here facing a serious problem, and that's why I understood very quickly that a ceasefire on the ground among the domestic players was not possible. And that is why I worked for 6 months together with Madame Merkel in order to produce the Berlin Conference in January 19th, 2020. And I'm very proud of that because it took us 6 months to build. And Madame Merkel was able to bring all the principles to that table. Mr. Putin, Mr. Erdogan, everybody was there. And we had conclusions. And these conclusions meant exactly, explicitly, that all these countries present around this table will not send mercenaries, will not send ammunition, will not interfere. And we transformed this against all odds into a UN Security Council resolution 2510. However, in the 6 weeks after the Berlin Conference, more than 40 ships coming with weapons and mercenaries and ammunition landed in various ports in Libya to the two-side advantage. I think that hypocrisy is something that is common in relations among powers. But I think that it has reached in Libya a level that was, at least to me, becoming unbearable. And I believe that this dysfunction of the Security Council when it comes to Libya is bad for international security, bad for multilateralism. I know that multilateralism is something used in a very discriminate way by great powers, but in Libya, it's entirely ignored.
So I have so many questions, and we still have to open it up at some point for the public to ask questions as well. But let me turn very briefly to the mercenaries. The Turks have reportedly sent in hundreds of fighters, many from Syria. The Russians have reportedly deployed hundreds from the Wagner group. Why mercenaries, first of all, and what difference have they made on the ground, particularly because you said there isn't that much fighting or that much death that we know of? Is it largely a mercenary war now when it comes to the fighting?
I won't say that Libya is a war without warriors, but I would say that as compared to other conflicts, non-Libyan fighters' role is higher than any other conflict I know of. Non-national fighters. There are not hundreds of Syrians on the GNI side. There are thousands of them. And on the other side, you have also people from Chad, from Sudan, from Darfur, from South Sudan, and possibly from other countries as well. So you have a country that is 3 times France, Robin, 3 times France, 1,600,000 square kilometers. It's a huge. Let me remind you that it takes you one hour flight between Tripoli and Benghazi. I mean, it's a huge country. And the number of people who are there is already limited, like 6 million. And the number of people who are ready to fight and willing to fight is even more limited. Therefore, there is an organic need for foreign fighters. And foreign fighters come. They come for money because they are much better paid in Tripoli than in Idlib, and or in Benghazi than in Sudan. And they also come because they are also promised citizenship. And many of them would like to have a second citizenship, be it Libyan or Turkish. Therefore, there are attraction. And therefore, yes, mercenaries play an important role in the fighting.
So when we had breakfast in New York, you said something that has really stuck with me. And that was that there was more use of drones and a greater number of drones in the conflict in Libya than anywhere else in the world. And I think that we in the West are not as aware. I mean, we're aware when we use them to take out, a militant someplace. But the regular use of drones in warfare at such a high percentage. Can you talk a little bit about what difference that has made and what the drones are used for?
Well, look, when the US was using drones, for example, in Yemen to kill terrorists or something like that, the number of countries producing drones was very, very limited, 4 or 5. Now, drones are being produced by N number of countries, including Turkey, for example, that produces the Bayraktar and the Bayraktar 2, which is more advanced, and including the Emirates that produces or has been using and producing Chinese Long. And other drones are available to other countries. So drones are now almost as common as Kalashnikov, I would say. Almost as common as Kalashnikov. And therefore, you can use them. If you lose one of them, it's not a big loss compared to a Rafale or to F-15. And you can use them without casualties, because if one of them falls, nobody's killed, in it. There is no pilot. And 3, you can use them from afar, which allows for this. That is the thing that allowed me to differentiate between a proxy war and a war by remote control. The drone is the typical instrument for a remote control war, because you do not even need the proxy. You can hit a target, and then the proxy can take advantage of it the next day or a week later, or not take advantage of it, but you would have hit your target. So it's not expensive as it used to be. It's produced by too many countries. It's available on the market, and it doesn't produce any casualty, and it can remain anonymous. It is deniable. Yeah. And most of those who interfere in Libya will never recognize the fact that they interfere there. So they are happy with such an instrument. On the ground, it has been used in the battle for Tripoli in order to destroy some military concentration, some new weapons and ammunition being deployed, but also, unfortunately, dozens of health centers in the city and its periphery, which I really regret.
So I had dinner with a four-star general last month, and he said one of his greatest concerns everywhere in the world was what he called the Costco drone. Costco being a chain in the United States that you can buy things cheaply and abundantly, which, again, a very striking comment. So let me ask you briefly, and again, I've got so many questions and I've got to open it up shortly. Is what we are seeing in Libya reflective of a new kind of war, or is it just another Middle East conflict that sucked in the world, only with different weaponry and, some different players? Is Libya something we're likely to see replicated elsewhere?
Unfortunately, yes. Of course, there is no size that fits all, and each conflict has its own characteristics. And not all countries can produce millions of barrels of oil. Not all countries are so underpopulated. Not all countries are so strategically situated. So Libya has a few characteristics. Still, what I see across the world is what I call the deregulation of force. Like you had the deregulation of economics, like 40 years ago. Around the year 2000, you had the deregulation of force. It started with the war in Afghanistan. It was even worse with the war in Iraq. I opposed. And it became common in Crimea, in Ukraine. It became common in different places. Now, a lot of the norms and rules and laws that regulated the use of force before 2000s are lost. And the great powers are not giving the best examples to regional powers. If the great powers do not play their role as provider of order, and I can tell you that the US is not providing order or has not been providing order in the past few years. If the great powers do not provide order, but on the other hand, sometimes use force in a more or less legal way, they are not the best examples. And what is happening is that regional, new, ambitious powers are just trying to copy them, and they are copying them big time. That is why you mentioned the French-Italian rivalry. It's very marginal to the Libyan story. It's something everybody can read, but it is what is in the game, in the daily game, are regional powers who are fighting each other. And I would add one footnote to that. When it comes to this part of the world, Russia doesn't consider itself as a world power, but as a regional one. And that is why in Syria, in Iraq, in the southern Caucasus, and in Libya, it smells of the 19th century Ottoman-Russian Empire conflict. It smells, it is there. It is the same place, and it's the same rivalry, and it's the same sort of agreement within conflict that characterized the Russian-Turkish relationship.
So they're going to shoot me if I don't open it up shortly. But you mentioned the United States, so let me ask about that. By the way, I really like your term, deregulation of force. I think that's very 21st century. But you mentioned the United States. You came to Washington to try to engage the Trump administration, which officially recognizes the government in Tripoli, but President Trump has had words of praise for General Haftar, who was a former CIA asset, as well as a former ally of Muammar Gaddafi. So the United States hasn't seemed to have had as much interest in Libya since Chris Stevens, a friend of both yours and mine, was killed. How much responsibility does it bear, either directly or indirectly, for lack of leadership for the prolonged conflict? And more to the point, I need to ask you to be as brief as possible. What can the next administration do, whether it's the Trump administration again or a new Biden administration?
Look, it is not entirely true, Robin, that America has shut its eyes on Libya. On two specific points, I have found a lot of American engagement in my contacts with the American administration. The first point is the fight against terrorism. And I can tell you that AFRICOM is very, very active in Libya. Very active in Libya. It's the most active player in Libya now against terrorism, and has been AFRICOM, and possibly the CIA as well. But AFRICOM has statements and CIA doesn't. And it is working with both sides. AFRICOM is working with Sarraj, and AFRICOM is working also with Haftar. So again, in terms of terrorism, anti-terrorism, the Americans have always been active. And the second point, when the maximum pressure started on Iran, there was a lot of pressure from the Americans in order to have the Libyan oil back in the market. And that's why when I was successful in bringing back that oil into the market again, after the oil crescent crisis and then with the Sharara crisis, the Americans were very supportive of the UN. So on these 2 points, the Americans have been active. What I wish from the next administration is that the UN mission now is very studiously and very firmly implementing the Berlin conclusions, to which Mr. Pompeo was part, and the administration was part. And I hope that the American administration, new one, be more active, be more open in closing the events chapter and in supporting specifically the implementation of the political part of the Berlin Conference, which should take place, COVID permits, in the first week of November.
Well, this is my last question, I promise. Can you look at the future for us? You tried very bravely and imaginatively for 3 years to find a diplomatic solution. How confident are you that the Libyans can come together to resolve their differences? How confident are you that the foreign powers involved will also be willing to compromise with each other in order to facilitate peace and reunify this country?
On the international level, we have a text of 55 paragraphs on which all these countries, relevant countries, have agreed. That's the Berlin Conference of January 1929, or the resolution 2510 that translated it legally. For the Libyans, yes, I have a message that the conditions have never been as propitious as they are now for their agreement. There is some kind of balance of power among them, and there is more fluidity in political dialogue among them. I have witnessed their military negotiation last week on the Red Sea. It's much more fluid than the one we had in February and March of this year. I have seen that they have met in Morocco, in Buznica. They have met in Malta. They have met around the Constitution in Cairo last week. So there is much more fluidity. It is very crucial that this fluidity is translated into an agreement. And the UN mission is putting before them an agreement for the reunification of the country. And some steps, positive steps, have been done. The oil was zero for 7 months. Now the country is producing 330,000 barrels a day. And one energy expert you know and I know told me that the price has gone down $3 only because of these 300,000 barrels produced by Libya. So they are producing oil thanks to our pressure, but they are also accepting the idea, very crucial idea, of auditing the central bank to know where the money is coming from, where the currency is being printed, and how the money is distributed, which, as I said at the beginning of this program, is a crucial matter in a rentier country, a rentier economy like Libya, where basically everybody is a civil servant and everybody depends on the state to distribute the money. Therefore, the time is now to go and make a deal. And I feel, I don't have a guarantee, that the international community, if it doesn't exist, okay, I agree with you, it doesn't exist. But say the relevant power when it comes to Libya if they don't help in bringing this agreement together, they will not oppose it systematically. So yes, the Libyans should move now and transform this political fluidity into a political agreement. I haven't seen in the past 6 years a time as propitious as today.
Okay, so one of our first questions is, what's the best realistic end state in Libya, and what is the worst? And I will add to that, if this diplomatic effort doesn't work, and the war is prolonged, it gets deeper and so forth, what are the dangers in terms of that worst case scenario, that Libya is carved up by rival Russian and Turkish interests, or historic local rivalries?
Look, the worst scenario is the return to the fighting, from which 1 year from now, we will discover that nobody can handle the whole country. I am ready to bet there is no possibility for any of the parties in Libya to control the whole country. For different reasons, we don't have the time to explain. So the worst scenario is to go back to this kind of fighting, and to go back to even more investment by foreign forces in the various groups in Libya, and to the arrival of more mercenaries into the conflict, and of the overflow of that country into neighboring countries such as Tunisia and Egypt, which could happen anytime. In fact, the situation in Libya is already making life much more difficult in Niger and Mali, where terrorism is flourishing big time. So this is the worst scenario. The optimal scenario is that the Libyans seize this November attempt to bring them together to produce a new unified executive, and stick to it and produce it, and have election in a year from now when everything is ready for the election in order to produce a legitimate government, because most of the institutions in Libya, in fact, all of them, are legally illegitimate, legally way beyond their validity date. So to produce, this is the optimal scenario. The most likely scenario is a frozen conflict, is to remain along the Sirte Jufra line with nobody moving in a substantial way, no unified Libya, and a lot of tension in order to produce 10,000 barrels more from this field or from that field, in order not to print money everywhere in the world. This is a likely scenario, but the optimal scenario, that they come together and it is feasible. And I can tell you, I haven't seen that in the past 6 years.
But you didn't quite answer my question about the danger of the place falling into two rival states, de facto.
No, I don't see this happening. I don't see this happening. The interaction, look, if you look at those who lived in Benghazi in 2011, 1/3 of them came from Misrata. If you look into Tripoli, we say that Tripoli is like 1/3 to 40% of the country. Where do they come from? There are streets entirely where people from Benghazi live. So there is a lot of interaction. There is a lot of movement. This has been a very, very nomadic society where people moved and crossed and lived and changed cities, etc. So the country is not divided into East and West, has never been divided into East and West. The country is atomized, has exploded into a number of local conflicts, a number of autonomous cities, a number of autonomous armed groups. So it is not divided into two, and it will not be divided into two. And I don't think that even a Sirte Jufra line is sustainable. But it is likely if nothing is done on the political side.
So we have another question. How does Prime Minister Sarraj's recent decision or announcement that he was going to resign at the end of the month affect the prospects for peace, given, and what, who will succeed him?
This is a very good question. I have discussed it with him at length, even very, very lately. I think the man is really, really tired. I think the man has not seen his family for many, many years. And I think the man is very sincere in his wish to allow for some kind of refurbishing of the presidential council, Who will succeed him? I think in our plan, the UN plan, nobody will succeed him. He will be succeeded by a division of his many roles into at least two. One as member of the Presidential Council of 3, not 9, because out of the 9, only 3.5 are really working. So a lot of parts of the country are not really represented in the Presidential Council. So somebody can come and play his role as formal head of state, president of the Presidential Council, and some more technocratic, active, and energetic and less tired guy can come and play the role of a prime minister. At least during this preliminary period that leads to election, where you need to organize the country for election, for which I think the Libyans are ready. And they are now, while I'm talking to you, they are voting in municipal election across the country. So they want elections, but you need some unified government to go into this direction. And if we have a technocratic government led by a technocratic prime minister, while Sarraj's role as sort of number one, formal number one, is occupied by some other guy, that would be, I think, the most realistic solution to his eventual departure.
You mentioned the people voting and people wanting to vote. And it's been very striking that we've witnessed the first real protests in both the East and the West. What does that reflect about public sentiment and support for the two rival governments or the kind of big players? Is there something brewing, or is it like it was during the Arab Spring that people know what they don't want, but they haven't come together to figure out a third way or a different way?
I was praying during my 2.5 years in Libya to see this demonstration in the street. Praying. Why? Because you could not understand how a country that makes so many millions of dollars and billions of dollars in oil has so many shanty towns, didn't build a school for 30 years, didn't replace a single pipeline since 1982. Could you imagine the leakage? Could you imagine the leakage? I mean, how you could live like Kuwait and you are living like Somalia? Why? Why? Mm-hmm. You can do that. I think the population has been late in asking this question, East and West, and I'm happy that they go and do that. Now, we should be careful. It is not that the civil society is developed and organized and articulate to the point of making something similar to what happened in other countries. But still, it is the beginnings of a civil society that asks the right question. We deserve better. We are in an oil country and we are living like one of the poorest countries on earth. And this is a very important question that has not been properly asked by the Libyans themselves from their leaders. And it's high time they do.
But you didn't answer the part of, is there a movement that is coming together?
Not strong enough, not organized enough, but it is there. It is starting. You know, I don't want to go into details and play on my professor past, but there is something called civil society in English covers two different concepts in my part of the world. Mujtama Ahli, which means a traditional civil organization, and Mujtama Madani, which means an urban civil society. I think that Libya is very strong when it comes to Mujtama Ahli, that is the traditional, but not enough moving to an urban where cooptation replace your blood link. So I think it is in a transition. That's why the civil society is not strong enough to sort of challenge the government, both in Tripoli and Benghazi, into having the minimal services the population deserves.
So we're really running out of time. I have two quick questions. One is, when you look on, well, maybe I should ask you about Haftar first. We've talked about Prime Minister Sarraj. Haftar is ailing. He's a senior citizen. What happens in the East if he's not around or not commanding, strong enough to command his forces. Can that front hold together?
I'm not sure, but I hope it does. I think whatever he has been able to build in the past 6 or 7 years remains useful in order to provide order in the areas in which he is in control of. And I don't want this force to dissipate or disintegrate. But does it mean that it is guaranteed, or that it should be given to some of his sons by inheritance? No, this is different, because this will destroy the very idea of an army. I hope it helps in rebuilding some army for the country, and in the meanwhile, it keeps order in the east and in the south where it is deployed. I think this deployment is needed, even for civil society. But what will happen to this is a big challenge. And I think one of the things is that the more it looks like a modern army, and his supporters should make sure that it survives him, because the country needs that organized force, although it doesn't need it to be like a horseman going to take power.
If we had more time, I was going to ask you about the priorities of a new government, and including building a new army, but we don't have time for that. So one last question, since this is really about the global disorder. What does Libya's conflict reveal about the global disorder today and the future of multilateral institutions, international organizations, places like the UN, in being able to resolve them? Because the UN hasn't been able to do it. Its resolutions were violated. You left in frustration because the members of the United Nations were violating the things they promised to do. So what is it? What are the lessons out of Lebanon? What does it tell us about global disorder?
My frustration has not weakened since. In fact, I'm unhappy. I'm very unhappy because the Security Council is not working, neither as a collective security to provide security to where it is needed, nor even as a place where you trade properly my conflict against yours. So at least as a minimum, it could be a trading place where me and you can come and say, be nice to me there and I'll be nice to you there. It is not working even on that. Mm-hmm. And they took, months in order to answer the Secretary General call for a ceasefire due to the COVID. The Security Council is not working because the relations among the big powers are not working. Because some countries are against multilateralism, some countries are indifferent to multilateralism, and some countries want to use multilateralism in order to help in their emergence as a world power. So that makes the UN an instrument in the hands of the big powers, and a not very useful instrument. And very often, it's very hard for us to explain to our interlocutors on the ground what kind of international community we do represent, while we know that the first characteristic of the international community is that it doesn't exist. It doesn't have enough solidarity. It doesn't have enough respect for norms to really exist. My problem now is that let us not substitute the main function of the UN, which is to provide peace and security, with so many very good things, very important things: gender parity, protection of children in warfare, climate change. All these issues are very central. But let us not be happy to say, since we can do nothing on peace and security, we have all these things we can work for. I'm so happy that the World Food Program was given the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it deserves it, and it is doing a wonderful job. But let us not say we can content ourselves with humanitarian action, with etc. If we fail on the main issue of providing peace and security as UN, we cannot compensate for it with anything else.
Ghassan, we have literally run out of time. You, as always, are brilliant in your analysis, very thoughtful in helping us understand what's happening in Libya and the stakes for the rest of the world in the 21st century. Libya will be, in some ways, a barometer of how we move forward over the next days, in next weeks, next decades, in these conflicts around the world. So I thank you so very much. I thank Fred Wary and Bill Burns for hosting this conversation today. And thank you. I hope to run into you after the pandemic, either in the Middle East or Europe or a street corner in New York.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Thank you.